politics and the promise of change has ebbed and flowed. But we have a very timely set of strategies and a new toolkit for protecting immigrant workers, not just in the right to organize, but also in a whole host of other employment and labor rights on the job. We will have a Q&A around about 45 minutes or so into the program. And we encourage all of you on the program to put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will start with those and then see if we can have more of your stories and discussion later on in the program. But we're going to start with Natalie giving us some of the context of what is happening right now and setting the context for worker protections and what strategies are possible right now. So Natalie, please.
Great, thank you very much, Ruben. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. We got some slides for you. But hi, I'm Natalie Patrick Knox. I'm with Jobs with Justice, as Ruben mentioned. I have been working with Jobs with Justice for over 10 years on this exact thing, right? And so I get to do a little bit of the lay of the land. Some of this will be review for some of you who have been at past LRAN workshops or other or AFL conventions or other places where we have done workshops on this theme. But the good news is that we have made some serious progress in the last couple of years and even in the last couple of weeks. And we're expecting a lot of what we're saying here today to be formalized and have some more tools to even work with in the coming days. So glad to be here with you all today. So Carlos, Liz, and I have been working together in the Injury to All campaign over the last several years to explore what is possible for protecting immigrant workers who are exercising their rights. At Jobs with Justice, we started working with the AFL and the painters specifically around U visas as a really good tool to protect victims of crimes. It's a visa, for folks who are not familiar with it, it's a visa designed specifically for victims of crimes, including some workplace crimes. But the U visa is a very narrow protection that only covers a very narrow set of crimes, and it's a high bar to get to. So in the process of using that as like the best tool we had, we also realized we needed to be pushing for more tools. Like there is the fundamental tenet that we all believe and is supported in a lot of ways in the policy, that all workers have rights regardless of status. This is something we say a lot, that we have know your rights programs about, but what does that mean? Like, what does it mean that workers have rights? How can they access them? How can we enforce those rights? So for example, we have a lot of good federal policies on worker rights, but there is like what's on the paper versus what is the reality for workers on the ground. So with federal labor law, we have a lot of protections under the Department of Labor, under the NLRB, and under the EEOC that protects workers' right to organize, protects their right to come forward or report abuse, protects them from discrimination. But in practice, we know that unscrupulous employers, the bad bosses that are out there have figured out ways to get around those. And there has just been a really, declining and weak enforcement of labor law, and that has given bad employers, reinforced, their tactics, and has given them, and immigration in particular is one of those things that bad employers can look to skirt some of the labor law enforcement. Additionally, on the books, we also have good things on paper in the immigration side of things. Department of Homeland Security and ICE specifically have their own policies, their operating procedures, their internal priorities that say that labor law should take precedent over immigration enforcement, recognizing the fact that workers have to be able to come forward to report labor abuse. Labor law is highly driven by complaints. And for a complaint-based system to work, workers can't be scared to complain. So ICE and DHS policy recognize this. And the agency has memorandums of agreement with the labor agencies also confirming this, saying that we should work together to make sure that workers' rights are protected. But the reality, right, is that these are top line things buried in memos between labor secretaries and DHS secretaries, and there hasn't been guidance to the field, right? So the NLRB board agents and the DOL investigators historically haven't had, any instruction on what this means. ICE's operating instructions that say, buried in some manual somewhere that say that ICE agents should take into consideration, any possible labor violations occurring or that pop up in their investigations. How is that being taught to ICE agents? And then what do they do? Like that level of putting the policy into practice has been largely absent. And this is coupled with the lack of the policy, actually being enforced has been in this environment where we see ramped up immigration enforcement, more and more money being put towards immigration enforcement. Meanwhile, labor agencies are, fighting for some scraps of, the federal budget. And you can see in this graph here, the real stark difference between how much we spend on immigration enforcement in this country versus what we spend on labor law enforcement. And so that imbalance of there's a lot of ICE agents and immigration agents out there in the field that are supposed to be doing something. So they're busy. And meanwhile, there's not very many labor law or DOL investigators, like in Arizona, where I've been working with our local chapter in Arizona Jobs to Justice. The DOL has to prioritize cases because they don't have enough investigators to do all of the wage theft cases that are brought to them. And it's not just us that know that, employers know that, as far as what folks see on the ground. The workers know that too. What they see in their communities, they are more likely to have seen an ICE agent or have heard about ICE coming into contact with a coworker than a labor law investigator. And so all of this sets us up for this huge gap, this huge chasm that workers have been living in, where there are some policies on the books that theoretically, back up that tenet that, all workers have rights regardless of status. But there hasn't been a great way to enforce those rights. So that's the sort of policy layout. But so through Injury to All, Carlos and Liz and a lot of our friends have been pushing to try and close that gap. And we have been doing that alongside really brave workers who are also, wanting to organize, wanting to report wage theft, wanting to fight their fights in the absence of promised protections, but knowing that, they want their workplaces to be better and they want to do something now. And so we have, the Injury to All campaign, which has been supporting workers' fights over the last several years and trying to meet them with the advocacy needed to make those policies better. So we're kind of, Carlos and Liz will get into more of this later, but we've been building the ship while sailing a little bit as we walk alongside workers. This picture here is of Fermin from the El Super campaign in California. It was a UFCW campaign back in 2015, I believe. So during the Obama years, we made some real grounds on closing this gap. And Fermin was part of an organizing campaign and a contract fight there at El Super and and was retaliated against by the boss, threatened with deportation, and actually had ICE called on him. And UFCW, the AFL, and national partners rallied around Fermin. People moved to inside strategy with the agencies, with the NLRB and DHS. And then there was also a public campaign, a pretty good Twitter storm that Jobs of Justice and other folks engaged in to say, hey, wait, there's these policies on the books that say that his rights should be protected. What are you going to do for him? And with this huge rally around him, UFCW and Fermin were able to win temporary immigration protections and a work permit in a really short period of time that allowed him to continue to organize and help make sure that that campaign was ultimately successful there. And so Fermin's case is like just this beacon. But it's also, at the time, it was so daunting because it was so much work to protect one worker, right? And it proved the point that the agencies are able to protect workers, but it also proved the point that there's not a good process, right? Like it shouldn't take, a ton of national organizations and legal teams to protect one worker at a time. So there's been other fights that have built on from Fermin's win there. The Painters Union, District Council 51 in Washington, D.C. Was supporting a group of workers at a recycling plant in Maryland. Those workers were organizing and suffered like a whole battery of retaliation. And those workers and the Painters Union and Jobs of Justice were able to really pressure the NLRB to stand up for those workers. And over like a series of years was able to get the NLRB, but it took years to get the NLRB to go to bat for the workers over and over again. But those workers were able to help ultimately get the NLRB to release a new memo in 2021. So I think it was last fall. The NLRB has now a series of memos actually that provide really concrete instructions on how board agents are to handle cases if immigration threats might be at play. And this is more in detail in the on what Carlos is going to talk about and in the toolkit that we can share afterwards. But having that concrete instructions of how the NLRB board agents are to handle immigration threats is that on-ramp, right, for like advocates and workers to be able to get protections. And then likewise, there's been other cases that have pushed the DOL on the labor side, on the labor agency side, and the EEOC. The DOL has put out their own FAQs last July, outlining concretely how investigators are to communicate with DOL headquarters if immigration threats are at play in a case that they have. So that has been won by worker cases. And then there is a group of folks that are currently advocating and have cases at the EEOC, and we've heard good things coming out of the EEOC, even though they haven't published anything publicly yet. But the goal is to get to that clarity, right? To have something that is publicly available, so it doesn't take somebody at a Jobs with Justice or at an AFL-CIO to know the worker personally or to know about the case for that worker to be able to access those protections. So as we've been moving these cases, we have a process that has emerged. And Carlos will go a little bit more in depth about what that process looks like. But basically what we've won and what workers have won in their fights is currently, if a worker has a case with a federal labor agency, NLRB, DOL, EEOC, they can apply to Department of Homeland Security for temporary immigration status. The most common one that most of the folks that I've mentioned so far, most of the cases have received, is deferred action, sometimes parole, for the immigration legal wonks out there. And most folks have heard of deferred action because of deferred action for childhood arrivals. So that is one example of where a deferred action protection has been used at a large scale, and so folks are familiar with that. But deferred action is a type of temporary status, and similar to the deferred action for childhood arrivals, what we've seen in the labor cases is that workers can win a 2-year protection from deportation, which is renewable for the life of the case. So if the NLRB case takes years, as we've seen sometimes with the NLRB, unfortunately, after 2 years, that case is still going on, they can reapply for that protection from deportation. It also comes with work authorization, which we know is often the most important thing to make that deportation protection and immigration protection real for workers, because it means that they can be more choosy in their jobs if they're, they're like more portable and more free to exercise their rights if they are able to pick better jobs. Excuse me, I'm suffering from a cold here. And then it also comes with a Social Security number, which has a lot of knock-on benefits for workers. And deferred action gives access to unemployment insurance, another really important thing for workers and their families across the country. So this is huge, right? Like, workers, if they are participating in a labor dispute, if their work site is under investigation by a federal agency, they could be covered. They could apply for these protections. So that is great as like what we need in the immediate for workers to participate in labor disputes. It is not the end of our fight for better immigration policy in this country by any means. The temporary protection itself is not a pathway to citizenship, so it doesn't allow a path to adjust status. It doesn't allow for somebody to access public benefits like food or housing assistance sort of stuff. It doesn't allow people to sponsor family members, which is huge, because we know that threats of retaliation are often trickle through families and communities, right? So it's not just if I shows up at my house, it'll hurt me. It could also hurt anybody else in my house who might be undocumented. So that family sponsorship is important with that we see offered in U visas and some of the other better longer term solutions. And it doesn't provide voting rights. So all of that to say is, like, this is great for labor disputes. And we still have more work to do to make sure that immigrant workers have all the dignity they deserve in our communities. So, so with this, I think I'm just going to go ahead and pitch it over to Carlos, if that's okay, to dig a little bit deeper into this process and what we've learned and the tools we have available.
Awesome. Thank you, Natalie. And hello, everyone. Hope you all are well. It was great to start seeing some of folks on the attendees and just a lot of familiar names and friends. I guess quickly, and before I get into the substance of what I was going to talk about, which is a little bit about the toolkit, what's in it, and really the steps to tapping into the tools, wanted to share a few more things about injury to all, and then quickly get to the heart of it, right? But just for context, the Injury to All campaign and an effort that Natalie was speaking about was born in 2014. And in some ways was an effort to try to collectively address the problems that come from and connected to how immigration status and enforcement was being used and weaponized as a tool by employers to freeze and stop workers who were organizing and speaking up. And Natalie was, kind of showing us some of that. But the work itself is and even the victories, I think we should, and Natalie, you were speaking to this, and I think I just want to emphasize this, is really a credit to the workers, the organizers, and the organizations, and really the movements that have been fighting and talking about this for a long time, and certainly precede me, and will probably be here long after I, right? And so, but some of these tools that we're talking about, actually, we saw our first successes, and Fermin's story is a bit about that in 2015, 2016. But as you can imagine with tools like this, and this is kind of some of the contexting here, we took a bit of a pause, right? We weren't able to utilize them during the Trump administration. And that's important to note because there are implications. This isn't a permanent fix. But maybe more important than that, right? That is no longer the case. And we presently have an administration that has not only heard of this, but is acting and starting to deliver on one of these, on this, which was, I think, a top priority for this campaign. And so I'm going to talk specifically about the iteration of injury to all and where we're at right now. And so this barcode, because I'm going to be referencing a toolkit that you don't have in front of you, is how you all can get, just send us a note and we will share you onto the toolkit, get it to you. It's not publicly available or posted on our website, but we do want to make it available to organizers and organizations. So this will take you to a quick page just to let us know who you are, and we'll get it over to you in a rather timely fashion. As Natalie noted, this is a bit of a busy week, but we are, staying on top of that. And so we actually launched, and Natalie, Liz, a bunch of you all, and many others, some of you may be on this call, were a part of this. We launched this toolkit and the program we're doing right now back in September, and had a really incredible room full of organizers and campaigns who had active cases in work or were potentially in a position to take advantage of these tools. And we came, got our minds and our hands together around what it was, questions, and more importantly, I think left with a commitment to get to work. And to make sure that, like, we, other organizers we knew, unions, and anybody and everybody who could kind of make use of these, that we wanted to get the word out to them. So since that kickoff, we've had maybe about 17 trainings in the last 3 months with over 600 different organizers and participants from about 32, maybe more unions in about 31 states. And I say that because, I kind of had hoped this would be the case, and yet I'm still surprised. There's been a massive interest in this toolkit and in this kind of opportunity across industries, across geographies, and across a range of organizations. And that's actually really good and important, as right now what we have is, an opportunity and a bit of a nascent one, but it's going to be really important that we take ownership and we really grab this one, build it up, and use it up to its full potential. And even then, as Natalie was saying, it's not comprehensive immigration reform. It's not a permanent fix. And so there's more work to be done. But the toolkit and the trainings we're doing and would love to work with you all on are hopefully an effort to get us all using some of this. So now with that kind of little context, I'm going to run through 8 kind of steps or things that you'd see in the toolkit, with the caveat that this is not one of our monthly trainings. I'll share more of that later. And in those, we'd go into more detail and actually, kind of brainstorm and talk more with organizers. But we do want to kind of walk through it and kind of, make sure that folks here have a space to better understand it. So just really quickly, what you're going to find in the toolkit before I go through the quick 8 steps in it, you're going to find a step-by-step guide for organizers and organizations to understand the process, to map it in your kind of campaign kind of cycles, timelines, and to utilize the process. You will find samples and templates of letters, guidance, even recommendations on teams and capacities that you might need as you're organizing and trying to tap into it. You'll find educational content and some supporting materials to do literacy and education in your unions. And a little bit more on that later, just around like benefits and who's able to access what, and some primers on status and what it means for organizing. You'll find contact info and a lot more. So really do encourage and hope people will pick it up. And we're happy to get that to you after, as Natalie said. So, all right, I'm going to jump into it and take you all through the 8 steps of what this is. So Natalie, if you could just start me with number 1, please. These are the 8 steps. I'm not going to go into detail again in all of them, but this is the 8, and we'll just get into number 1. So if you're going to take one thing away, and I'm actually not going to read these slides, so folks should check them out, but I'm not intending to read mostly what's on them. But if you take one thing away today, it might be that really the way that these tools and these protections come online and available is through the act of workers coming together to make improvements. Something many of us sometimes call organizing, right? And so to get more into what that means, right? We live and work in a country, and some of us have value judgments on this that puts an extremely large onus on workers and working people to ensure that there's effective and good enforcement of labor laws. That's a bigger conversation for many other forums. But it also means that when a worker files a claim, what they're doing is they're helping hold unscrupulous employers accountable. And by doing that, they're keeping more workers and all of us safer, right? But when they are scared into silence by the boss's tactics and intimidation, and there is now a situation in which laws are being violated, and a lot of that is putting a lot of us at risk. And so had made commitments and has made commitments to protect the workers who are engaged in a labor dispute. That's what these tools are about. And they define it rather broadly, right? It's workers fighting for the right to be paid a minimum legal wage, promised wage, overtime, the right to receive family medical leave and employee benefits they're entitled to, the right to a safe workplace and compensation for work-related injuries, right? The right to join, assist, or be part of a union, engage in collective bargaining, and the right to be free from retaliation for seeking or enforce the above rights, and a few more, right? And so, but the important thing here is that this is about ensuring that our labor laws are being enforced, and organizing and engaging your coworkers and speaking up is how this kind of comes online. Which is a little bit of a shift on things, right? And so number 2, number 1, you need workers in motion. And number 2, you need to detect, well, I can keep going. We'll scroll over to number 2. Number 2 is detecting risk of immigration-based retaliation. Natalie took us through a little bit of the budget breakdowns and where our priorities currently lie, and why employers can weaponize this. But I think for organizers, I think the thing to know is if and when you're in a campaign or organizing with a set of workers, it's important that we start trying to and quickly identifying or detect any risk of immigration-based retaliation, because if we can see that coming, it's important that we start thinking about these tools early, and if they can actually be used to prevent, the worker status from being weaponized. And so, we'll want to be doing some documentation of what that retaliation or those threats are, be that direct or indirect. And it doesn't even have to be, recent, right? And can also come from worker testimony, if that's what you have, right? But one, start documenting direct, indirect threats as the organizer or leads on the campaign. And 2, you really want to start thinking about legal counsel. One, if you're not familiar with agencies and kind of making requests or working with them, a labor lawyer to advise on how and when to engage agencies. And also, and we strongly have recommended this along the whole way, when we're doing these trainings, an immigration attorney who can ensure that the workers are making informed choices about whether to step forward and request status protections. We'll get into this, or if folks have more questions. We are happy and have been building a list of lawyers with expertise and can do referrals, and are doing a few other things to stand up capacity. But you want to be actually like talking to getting some legal advice, particularly because these are very new processes at the federal level. And so we don't want to be making a mistake or mistakes. I'll come back to that briefly in a second. And finally, you want to make sure that your organization and at least the organizers on the campaign have a basic understanding of what immigration status means for workers. And so some of the things you saw, those things. We can keep going to number 3, Natalie. You're the organizer. You've kind of gone about detecting risk, documenting it. Then you're going to go ahead and move forward to requesting labor agency support and accessing these worker protections, right? And so in the toolkit and trainings, we do go into more detail, and general guidance on how to work with various agencies. But it's just important to remember that part of what we're doing here is ensuring the enforcement of on the books labor laws, right? And working to ensure that our immigration enforcement is not used in such a way to undermine DOL or other agencies' ability to enforce labor laws in the geographic area or industry that's before us, and or to give rise to further immigration-based retaliation or the charge and duties of the NLRB, or really get in the way of other laws being enforced, right? And so one thing that I'll say about this is that in requesting the support of the agencies, we are asked, or you will need to share a description of what's going on and some picture. But actually here, and we try to really emphasize this. Organizers should refrain from providing any individual's immigration status or history, really personally identifiable information, as it's not needed at this point, right? This is just to kind of alert the agency to the broader issue, and the worker specific information is not needed for that at that point, right? So you put in your request with the labor agency, which takes us to step number 4. And step number 4 is important to name. I won't get into this. This is a little bit of the team or some of the functions and capacity that you might find yourself tapping into. But step number 4 is actually really important, and for 2 reasons. One, because there is a period of time or a gap that just is there in terms of getting a response from the agency, and we don't want to just be sitting on our hands or waiting to hear about what's going on. We actually want to now start talking and screening workers. And on this, I'll say that one of the most important things to keep in mind is that we want to be clear and honest with workers and workplace leaders around what these things and these protections are, what they're not, and making sure that they have a clear understanding of the benefits and or the limitations, as that really matters here. For unions also, we encourage folks to be very clear that, about our end goals and our interest, and which is often, yes, winning these protections, but also winning a union and getting more permanent and sustainable things in a union contract and having power at work, right? And so obviously the status protection is one way that we can ultimately secure that union contract and additional protections. But we do ask and encourage folks to be honest and transparent about all of that. And so and this is something you can start doing sooner rather than later, as it is taking it tends to be at least 30 days before you get a reply. Those timelines are shifting and getting quicker, but there can be a gap there. But as after you between submitting and receiving your documentation, which is step number 5 of your labor dispute, right? And the real thing to keep in mind once you receive your documentation, and there's sample letters of what this will look like, how to spot specific particular important information in the letters that you'll receive from agencies in the toolkit. Basically, what you'll want to assess is, does it cover the relevant workers that you were kind of looking to have covered by when you submit it? Over what time period is this effective? What locations? Are there multiple work sites that are covered under this? What about subcontractors and a few other things like that? You'll also clearly want to hone in on what the government's interest was in giving these protections. They're pretty good about letting you very clearly know what their interest is, and also how long the scope of the protections will last. Right, so those are some of the things you really want to identify in getting your letter back from the relevant agency. Number 6, once you've documented your labor dispute, once workers have been talked to and made an informed decision to submit a request for temporary status protection and work authorization, it's time to file the petition. And because these tools, and I think I mentioned this, are in the early rollout stages and it's a newer federal process, we strongly recommend that petitions be prepared or at least reviewed by an attorney. And so just some more information on the petitions and what will be asked for at that period. And so then after you've all done all of these things, we'll get to number 7, you submit, and then you do wait for a little bit, right? And so there is no singularly constant timeline for the process just yet, but workers in cases are starting to see responses in a matter of weeks. instead of months. This used to take a lot longer. And for now, DHS has assured DOL and us that all petitions responsive to labor agency requests will be handled in an expedited manner. And would also note that as soon as deferred action or parole is granted, when granted, you should immediately submit the request for a work permit. And here too, DHS has committed to expediting the process for these types of claims. And so the last thing, and then I'll pass it to Liz, who can tell us a little bit more about case studies and in practice what this could look like, is that, you know, the fight doesn't stop just in getting work permits or temporary protections, right? We want workers to get those protections, the status and everything that comes with it. And we hope and are seeing that it brings momentums to fights and campaigns. More people are willing to speak up, get involved in contract fight in the campaign. But really it doesn't end, right? We still need to win unions. We still need to fight for immigration reform. And so it's really important that this all be in the direction of building a bigger and broader movement for justice. And so I'll stop there. Just that's a quick look at the toolkit and some of the steps, but I will just say that then, and pass it off to Liz, that doing monthly trainings on the toolkit itself, right, and have a schedule that's now going to be going up. And we'd love to have you all join one of those. There is a little bit of a community of practice here that we've developed, and we also have monthly calls. And really that's folks that come to the trainings and then are doing the work or have cases and want to be talking to other organizers, brainstorming, thinking, or just working in partnership on some of that. And then there's a little bit, but it's limited and hopefully growing. There's increased kind of legal and other capacity and wraparound that we're doing to support campaigns, right? Making sure that that folks are having the maximum success, opportunity, and chance. And if that means connecting folks to kind of more established or seasoned labor lawyers, immigration lawyers, just connecting with other resource organizations and making sure that folks and organizers have what they need. And so again, I'll stop there. The barcode is a link to just get more information, the toolkit. And anyway, I'll stop. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Carlos. We have questions coming in. So just a reminder to put those questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to them after we hear from Liz. So Liz, please go ahead.
Great. I was going to ask that. Thank you, Ruben. Thanks, Carlos. And hello, everyone. As you heard at the top, I'm Liz McElroy. I'm the Director of Politics and Government Affairs, which includes politics, legislation, and policy for the painters and allied trades. I've been here just for a little under 2 years now, and sort of from day one when I walked in the door, I joined Natalie, Carlos, and the community of folks who have been doing this work, who had been doing it for a lot longer than I have, to really start the advocacy. So I'm kind of playing an interesting role here today. I'm going to give some examples of what we're doing at the IUPAT. We're not unique to this. There's a lot of others who are doing this work, but to just give a little of the context of how we're putting these things that Natalie and Carlos have talked about into practice. And I'll talk about that. And then I also, I want to give some examples like Carlos said. So like I said, when I walked in the door in April of 2021 to the painters, one of the first sort of policy things we started to work on was this process with the Department of Labor, Department of Homeland Security, and others. I think I know the folks on the call are familiar with this, but I think it's important to note, like Natalie said at the top, this isn't new. I think for us, what is new is being able to have this broader community of folks who are sort of all rowing in the same direction and having an administration that is listening and trying to listen. And it's not perfect system by any stretch, but we're trying to get real wins for workers. And so that's sort of where things started. I know there have been a whole bunch of steps with the Department of Labor, the Department of Homeland Security. One thing I do also want to throw in there is we're also, I think the next step for us is to really think about state agencies and how those labor organizations play a role in this as well, right? Because everything doesn't come through just one, there's not just one on-ramp into this, workers are filing cases at state levels. And we want to make sure that that is also part of the process, and that folks at the state agencies who might be well-meaning understand that they can petition for this as well to protect the workers in their states and their cities. the numbers that we saw from Natalie, from Carlos, about the immigration enforcement and the labor enforcement and those numbers. Just, I have a colleague who always says that the systems we have are designed perfectly to get the results we're getting. And so really, when you think about it, how those systems, those finances and are so disparate is really why this work is so important and why we at the Painters are undertaking it. It's the results that we're getting, right? That workers are exploited and that employers are allowed to know they can break laws with impunity almost in many cases because the accountability hasn't always been there. So a couple examples, and I actually think we might have covered most of these already. So Natalie mentioned the Tito's contractors in Maryland. Tito's contractors case in Maryland, where the workers filed NLRB claims, and just last year, now it's 2023, just last year, they were able to win some protection. So it's really exciting. It took 8 years, but it is a good example of that. Even before we had formal processes, workers were not, people weren't waiting, right? And so we can't wait until everything is sort of written down and documented in order to kind of keep moving these forwards. And so pushing these things forward. Obviously, that was in conjunction with the Painters, with Jobs with Justice. I think, we mentioned the case Unforgettable Coatings in Nevada, which was Ariba of Las Vegas, Ariba Las Vegas, sorry, and the Painters working to win protections for those workers over the course of many years. We have active cases now in Arizona, Georgia, Tennessee, Texas, Maryland, and others. And I say that because it's important to understand this is not limited by industry and this is not limited by geographical scope, right? It's easy to think that these things are only happening in certain places, but they're really happening anywhere that workers are exploitable, quite frankly, and they need our protections. And so we at the Painters, we're certainly not uniquely positioned in terms of labor unions to do this work, but we do have some things that make us unique. Our president was an organizer for many years. He was our organizing director. And so he has firsthand seen on the ground and worked with workers who are trying to organize their workplaces, to report violations, to do all those things, just like folks on the ground in my union and other unions are still doing. So that gives him a very urgent sense about this work. We're also an organization that has worked hard over the last few years to really tie our organizing and our political work together. And that is really important in this work. The organizers, as Carlos, I think, was saying, they're on the ground, they're talking to workers, right? They're identifying the issues, they're helping figure out what are the avenues to take things up, but without then having the legal team and the political team and others really willing to sort of pick up that mantle and work together, it's not gonna work. So internally, we have we work together as a group to do that. We've put this now into our culture at all of our. The reason I'm with you all today and not one of our organizing leads is because they're all in a training and they're talking about this very thing and how to make sure that they're issue spotting and identifying and bringing things up as needed. And, we have worked it into the fabric of our organizing culture. At every conference, at every training that we do, we're talking about this. So it is not just the folks in, like I said, in one area of the country or another who are doing it. It's all across so that we can make sure that we all have the same tools. And then I think, Carlos, what you just said is really important about this network that we have built, because it's really exciting over the past 2 years that I've been in this seat to see how that network has built, to hear the different unions, the different advocacy organizations talking at a table and really being able to share info, to share ideas, to help workers jointly together and really come together around this end goal of making sure that workers who do risk it all to come forward and lodge these complaints against employers are really given the full breadth of what we can give them. Obviously, as was said, we can't, there's not guarantees in this process, and there's not the path to citizenship and all of those things, but it really is a community of unions and partners and advocacy groups who have come together for many, many, many years, but have really now been able to gel and get some wins for workers. And I think that's, for me, I've spent many years in the labor movement, even though I've only been here for 2. And it's one of the most rewarding things I've been able to be a part of, because it really is a very concrete thing where we're impacting, workers' lives and their families, right? And taking this the next step forward, like I said, with state agencies, and also just making sure that our organizers on the ground know how to have conversations, how to make sure that they're talking to workers in a way that is responsive to their needs, but also as we try to work through the process, realistic with their needs is really is exciting as we move forward into 2023. I think I'm going to go ahead and stop there, Ruben, because I do know that we have a bunch of questions piled in there, and I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to get to them, and folks can ask if they have questions on my end.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks to all of you for your presentations. And yes, we do have some present questions, and I'm going to start with one from Xochitl Bala from about the strategies, if any, that were followed by the UFCW or AFL-CIO to communicate and create solidarity with independent Mexican unions in the case of El Super, whose parent company is based in Mexico under the Hui brand. Maybe Carlos or Natalie could start on those.
I could say a little, but it wasn't my campaign, though. It wasn't my hometown or that part of LA. So I kind of followed it a little bit more. But I couldn't answer the part of the independent Mexican union side. I think that, to be honest, that was a little bit beyond what I've heard or asked about. But I would say that there was actually a rather sophisticated and meaningful both grassroots community campaign in Southern California, and to mobilize in the communities at which El Super is located, and also like a comprehensive kind of pressure campaign that included investors and actually the company, because it's Mexican based, and I think the union had a 770 in this case, you had a rather sophisticated understanding of some of those things that really mattered to the company and tapping into it. And they were ultimately successful. And there's beautiful stories around how, they actually got and secured the protections for FedMean, like really defanged at the court, the employer, and really created momentum to kind of continue the fight. And I think in that context, they were in the contract fight and win that, right, and continue fighting. So I couldn't answer the deeper aspect of that, but I do know that this was actually one of the more exciting kind of well done campaigns of that nature that I've seen in a while. So Natalie, if you have more, and also I think it might be worth just connecting if you really want to connect more with some of the organizers who are part of this network, and I'm sure would be happy to share what they learned. And they have, there are some of the folks that are doing the training and have been really involved in writing the toolkit and making sure that we're all talking. So I'd share that, Ruben, but I don't know if that's enough, because it is a really good question too. I'm like, I kind of want to know too.
Go ahead, Natalie.
Yeah, I don't have, I'm not sure of the ties to the Mexican unions, although what I can say is that, hopefully with these strategies and being able to protect workers and do some of the work that Liz and Carlos were talking about building our organizing and political work together, we will be able to bring in more workers as like full leaders and their full potential to organize, right? And I think that's where we have the really good potential to do the international solidarity work, to think more strategically. We've been in such a defensive stance for so long that I think having these protections does just open up more bandwidth and more opportunities for workers to engage as their full selves in these campaigns. So hopefully we can do more things like that, engaging with other unions and doing bigger, bolder campaigns.
Yes, great opportunity for more international solidarity. Robert Christie asks, what happens when the cases or whatever case, whether it's an NLRB or DOL case is over and the 2 years have expired, can the status be renewed? Is there a problem with the workers being identified as undocumented and things change in the administration or politically? Who would like to address that?
You can go ahead, Natalie. Yeah.
Take a stab and then, yeah, back me up here. Technically, what we understand right now, well, let me back up for just a second. So what we have on paper right now, like the commitments we have on paper right now are from the labor agencies. The part that we're missing is from the Department of Homeland Security. And so that has been a problem because we're operating in a little bit of obscurity and a little bit on what has verbally been promised or what has been promised in some of these advocacy meetings that Liz and others have been going to, trying to get those commitments because Liz's members are sticking their necks out. And so we don't have those firm commitments from DHS yet, but we have had some promises and we have the examples of the cases. And so what we have seen and heard from the cases so far is that the chance for renewal really does exist within the case of like the longevity of the case. So once the case is closed, workers might not be able to reapply for protection. But from those cases, what we also know is that their information should be protected, much in the way that the DACA people who have applied and turned in their information to USCIS. USCIS is generally not in the business, and there are some firewalls between USCIS and ICE. So it's kind of the same assurances that we have with the DACA program, that information will not be used to burn workers who have voluntarily turned their information in. The other thing that we know from the cases, and not just these cases, but worker organizing in general, is that where workers are organizing, there is often a labor dispute. So just because one labor dispute ends for a worker, if a worker continues to be a leader and continues to engage with the union, there might be another shot for them to apply for protections if they again are sticking their necks out and are fearful that like immigration could interfere with that. So that's where I think it's really important that that fourth step that Carlos talked about, where we're building teams around these cases, so that we're not just getting lawyers together to process paperwork. We're actually putting together our unions, our community groups, our full folks, so that we can support the workers in becoming leaders, right? We're not this isn't just like a service thing that we can provide. It is an opportunity for organizing, and in that opportunity, hopefully those workers that get deferred action on this case can also fight in the next worker fight. And so I think there is room to imagine that ongoing protections in that way. Carlos, any other thoughts on that?
No, I always like doing the disclaimer, and maybe I shouldn't say this too much, that, well, I am not a lawyer, and so I would need to ask our legal team on some of this, but I do think, and I've heard some of them share, that, look, there are situations, though, in which, like, the remedies, like, they're not finalized, or the thing is not done by the 2 years, and so all indications are they would get like an extension or renewal at that point. I don't think we've had many of those happen yet, so we're kind of still talking in theory, but I do think the guidance that we hope is forthcoming kind of just helps clarify a lot of this and would make it a little cleaner. I did see a question on the Q&A around like, DACA or legal status. I mean, what I would say about this is that, and take this with a grain of salt, right? Because, president, I don't know if it has the same value that it used to, right? But there is a healthy kind of work and presidents in the legal field around like protections being awarded to work or to people for enforcement of laws. And you may have noticed, right, that we heavily talked about like this is about enforcing labor laws and ensuring that actually other laws aren't being broken. And so I think there was a strong, feeling that they could kind of survive a Supreme Court kind of attack. But again, president is, I'm not a lawyer, but president doesn't seem to hold the same kind of weight it used to. And the court is very different than it was maybe 10, 20 years ago. And so I couldn't tell you, right? So anyway, but we can, actually a lot of these questions are in the toolkit. There's FAQs and there's more technical answers. And so I kid you not, it's a really good toolkit. So we're excited to get that over to you all. And some of these things are answered, but if not, send us a question. We got a team that'll, check in with y'all.
Liz?
Hey, Ruben, can I just jump in? So not really to answer the question, because my colleagues already did it, but just to underscore something Natalie said, where she said, we've got the sort of the guidance and the FAQs from the labor agency, but not yet from DHS. And I think it's important to note that we're already moving case, like that hasn't stopped us from moving cases forward, right? And so, and it hasn't stopped, quite frankly, the Department of Labor from doing the preliminary investigations and then moving, statements of interest over so that we can start workers through that process, even as we are not sure what the end of that process looks like. And I think that's just a really important point because, advocacy and all these things can feel very slow and things sometimes do feel slow, but the fact that we are moving as it's happening, I think is also pushing it to happen faster. And so I think that's an important, and not we, the IUPAT, we, all of us in this space. And I think that's an important consideration.
Well, that's good advice from all of you. Again, best advice, check with your legal counsel. I mean, as someone who's taught Hoffman Plastics and to law students for 20 years, I can tell you that, Carlos is right, that the Supreme Court can do some strange things. There will, of course, be a question, I'm sure, about the authority for this regulation, which will be, eventually brought to the courts. So who knows what could happen there. But in the meantime, I know a couple of things. One, that the term labor dispute is really broad and advocates basically should make it as broad as possible. And two, that labor disputes tend to go on for a long time because employers are very recalcitrant in terms of agreeing to terms with their workers. So those things are on your side, I think, in terms of keeping this status going. There was also a question about, again, getting to this idea of the effects of, so the global effects that these policies will have. Henry Noble, asked what more can be done to force lawmakers to, because of the climate crisis, it's forcing more and more people to migrate. What can be done to force lawmakers to make their U.S. destinations more welcoming? And I think, again, Carlos, you might have mentioned or wanted to touch on the climate crisis, how that is impacting a lot of, again, what we're seeing in terms of workers seeking protection and deferred action. You want to address that?
I'll speak a little to it. And in some ways, I'm like, oh, we should do a whole thing on that. I worked with a colleague. And I think this is just a really great question because it's actually one of these where we should be talking about it now and the crisis before it hits, but the crisis is almost here. And if I had the chance last year to do a little bit of this because of Senator Murkowski and PRO-ACT and other things. But if you talk to the Alaska AFL-CIO, they tell you, we don't have to theoretically talk about climate crisis and relocation. We have people relocating across the state and now. Right, there's whole communities that just are needing to relocate because the climate around them is no longer supporting their ability to live there, right? And so it's just it's important that we in the lower 48 be talking about it, but it's here. And I mean, I think this is, and in some ways it's a bigger question, but it's totally related to this, right? I mean, I think I would say that my basic least common denominator answer is organize, grow, get workers power, get workers into unions, and so use these things, right? But that's not obviously enough for I think everything we're talking about. And I think this is where it matters that, even if imperfect, there's an administration that has laid the gauntlet down on being pro-worker, because that allows the question. And really the default right now in America is employer-centered, our workforce systems, employer-centered, our labor laws, like everything is employer-centered. And so by naming unions and working people, I actually think you could change things. And in fact, we have seen things like, more standards, more kind of consideration being attached to the IHAC, right? IRA, CHIPS, Build Back, like all of these things now have more standards and hooks that actually allow workers and worker power to be considered in a different way, and that's good. But I don't know. I mean, I feel like this is actually a really big one, and tools like this are really important. Even like I mentioned earlier, there's like literacy and educational materials in the toolkit on like immigration status and like how to talk in your union with folks and educate your teams on it. And that work is really important, right? Because it is important that we understand actually that part of the broader dynamic here that's kind of killing us is that, through different strategies, different sectors and geographies, like we all are experiencing an injury, right? Like there's injuries to all happening here. And so, I think that's why we're connecting and focusing so much on some of these tools, the program, because it helps prepare folks also to talk about those other things. But there's a lot more, and I'm like across the hall from me are all my colleagues on the climate and some of those teams. So I feel like I should probably go to some of them because then we're like, Carlos, you should have said these 10 things. But I would say in terms of some of this, I mean, I think we just need to recognize that like migration patterns are changing. There's a lot of things that are going to be changing, and so we need to be doing things like this and more to kind of prepare for that before it's a little too late. So I'll stop there. And not a great answer, Ruben, but I think that's where I'd start.
Great, thank you. Anyone else?
And just offer, I mean, the climate piece is a big piece that I think a lot of us are wrestling with and trying to figure out how to better take on. In the meantime, like one concrete way to work with Congress and push for more permanent solutions for workers. The Power Act does exist and is going to be reintroduced hopefully this spring. Jobs at Justice and the AFL and the painters and a bunch of other friends are also working on that on our policy teams. And that Power Act expands access to U visas. And will also codify, put into law some of these same protections with deferred action, this temporary protections for labor disputes. So, what the person was asking there, I think there was a part about what we can do for the long-term solutions if there is a change in administration. So the Power Act would both put in the things that we're talking about, these tools for temporary protections, that would put it into law, along with expanding access to U visas, which is a really good protection. It would eliminate the cap and get rid of the backlog and some other really important things that would get those protections to workers faster.
And I'll just add, because the question was also around what can we do to make lawmakers make this more welcoming, right? I mean, the only thing, going back to what Carlos said, organize, right? Like use our power to talk to our lawmakers, right? And figure out what the changes we need. That is like, you're all now shaking your heads being like, that's really naive. Like that doesn't happen, right? But it's incremental, right? And those are the things, but it is about organizing, right? I spent most of my labor career as like on political side of things, not on policy, but I started as an organizer, right? And to me, it's all the same thing. You're always just talking to different groups of people, trying to move different agendas in different ways, and it's all the same thing. And so, it's a really hard question, but I do want to say one more thing. I think like the climate crisis, the worker rights crisis, like all of these things, right? It's all about, at the end of the day, if you think of these things as just about workers and how workers can gain power and come together and make their world, their workplace something better, then it really is, sort of meshing of all those issues at once.
Great, thank you. Great answers to that question. Yvette Sierra Vigneault asks, will the toolkit provide strategies to address unique, intersectional discrimination, overlapping forms of discrimination faced by trans and gender nonconforming migrant workers? And maybe just a question for everyone about the possibility or maybe the precedent for different agencies like the DOL and the EEOC sort of in joint enforcement or joint jurisdictional campaigns or cases? Has this happened already? Is there a lot of communication between the agencies on these kind of intersectional cases? Who would like to start with that?
I can take what's in the toolkit, because I think in some ways, think of it like as a basic toolkit. So the answer is no, I don't think it includes some of that. It's mostly a stripped down, like the 1 to 8s kind of technical. This is kind of what the letters and the memos look like to demystify that, like sample what to expect. Contacts, I think what you're talking about is actually really important and would be worth like thinking through. Actually, both what you also said, Ruben, right? The precedent piece. I mean, I think we have a broad interest in making sure that we're setting healthy and good precedents. And Liz mentioned state and local agencies. The federal stuff is getting clearer. The state and local agencies, I still think needs a little bit more work. And so we would be very excited also to participate and work with folks in thinking through that, or, having a specific exploration of that one for a community of folks interested. So I think it's not currently there, but I think those are actually really important things. And I mean, some of it, and we didn't talk about it a bunch here, but I think, Ruben, you start getting to it, and we talked about it in the prep, which is like just the importance of pairing kind of organizing strategies and worker power buildings with and making sure that workers leaders and organizers have access and really demystifying like government affairs and can view it as a thing that we're using, and working more in tandem in our organizations and strategies is really important. So I'd love to pick that up and explore that, but no, it's not presently in the toolkit. It's much more basic than that, but it's growing. I mean, it is a growing toolkit. We'll add more to it. And there's a whole litany of resources beyond the toolkit, right? There's actually a bunch of other stuff we're tracking with the network. And so would love to kind of continue that one.
Yeah, and if you know of cases, oh, go ahead.
Well, and I do know folks like NILC and Arise was doing some training. So that, there's nothing proprietary about what's in the toolkit that's also part of it, right? It's mostly we just put it together and pulled it, are distributing, but it's a lot of this is also just what's on the guidelines, right? If you kind of look, but those are just very technical memos and maybe not as user friendly. So, but there are other folks also, thinking about this and who might actually have more advanced stuff than we do. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised. And yeah, anyway.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, I mean, if you are aware of cases that where we could support these cases and turn them into good case studies, we've built a lot of this just by, jumping in with workers who are experiencing certain types of abuse. And, if there is somebody that you are aware of that is experiencing discrimination on the job because of, gender or other issues, would love to figure out how to support and so that we can bring that forward and help other workers that might be sharing that experience. The EEOC is part of the agreements with Department of Homeland Security, the previous MOUs that these protections are based, rely a lot on. They are not as far along that I will say the agency itself, the EEOC, is not as far along as the other labor agencies. And so there is an opportunity and a need for folks to do advocacy with the EEOC. So I know our folks, the Painters Union and Arizona Jobs of Justice in Arizona right now are trying to figure that out, meeting with the EEOC over a discrimination case. In part to sort of shake that dust off of the EEOC, right? Like what Liz was talking about, joining the organizing with the political advocacy. There's a woman who has an EEOC case. We think that would be a really good case to get protections for that work site. But the EEOC doesn't quite know what to do with it at the regional level, although we've had some assurances at the headquarters level. So we, as advocates, can maybe make some real progress if we get everybody in the same room with the worker and say, this person needs your help. What are you going to do? So we're hoping to do that soon. But where folks have discrimination cases and are interested in doing EEOC advocacy, also happy to talk more about that or connect afterwards.
Thanks. And just again, Liz, you mentioned the collaboration here in Las Vegas between Arriba and the Painters Union. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more, and I know Rise Chicago was mentioned as well. I wonder if all of you could speak a little bit more to the role of worker centers in some of these different stories, and what are the best practices for going forward in terms of involving worker centers in some of these campaigns. Liz?
Sure, I'll start. So, and again, I'm not the organizing team, so I'm not always on the ground, but I think I'll just tee up Carlos and Natalie to talk more brilliantly about this. But I will say for us, it's imperative, right? I mean, we, it is imperative to have partners on the ground who are embedded in communities and who understand the needs of holistically of people. Like, we can go in and understand the needs on a particular workplace, but understanding the community and all of that is incredibly important. Natalie's mentioned Arizona and Nevada have been two places where we have an organizing team that's been doing this for a long time and themselves, they're not flown in. And so it's really important, but the partnership between a union, us in particular, but a union, but also with other unions and with the advocacy groups is the only thing that is going to keep moving this forward, right? Because I am just like all of you, as my colleagues, I can't be in 19 places at once. And, having this network of people who've done this before, who might have a different take on something, or who might have, hey, we have a partner group in a city that you just started organizing in, let us connect you, making all those connections. It's absolutely imperative. And I don't think, I don't see that this work could happen without those on the ground collaborations with worker centers and with other advocacy groups. But I haven't dealt specifically with them, so I want to kick it to my colleagues who've done a little more on the ground work.
Yeah, and actually, so this reminds me of a point I wanted to highlight about the labor agency support and like what that looks like for these cases. So when we ask the labor agencies for support, what that looks like is a letter of interest that covers an employer and the scope of the investigation. So it covers the work site over the years of the investigation. So if it's a industry like meatpacking, where there's like one work site for that employer, it'll cover that work site, and it'll go back 5 years for the DOL investigation. It'll cover any current or former worker for that work site. If it's a construction contractor, like Unforgettable Coating, like, AZ Painting and Contracting, some of these, like big DOL cases that have been going on, wage theft cases that have been going on, those work sites can span across states and cities, right? And the letter will cover all of those work sites, anything that is covered by the investigation, right? And so it's really important to have the worker center and the unions and everybody working together, because workers move, the contractors move, they like finish a project here and then open up another project there, and so worker centers might come into contact with workers who are on have complaints against an employer that already has a letter covering them, so like that the painters have asked for, right? Like if the painters are part of a big wage theft campaign and are trying to find the workers that could be covered by this, worker centers could play a really important part in doing that community outreach in other places. And this also happens not just the investigation, but in the compliance phase of the DOL cases. Like once there's settlements, like we know that sometimes it can be really hard to locate the workers to get the checks, and that compliance phase is part of the case too. So workers should be covered during that compliance phase as well.
Thanks. So Jorge Mujica provides a couple of points. First, he says ARISE is already processing over 100 workers in this program. And second, that DHS will release their guidelines tomorrow morning in a meeting with some AFL-CIO leaders. So I guess in the last couple of minutes we have, what are the sort of the best ways to talk about this program or this, and I guess sort of anticipating some of the things you'll hear. Basically, is this a new program? Is this an unprecedented program? Is this, just all kinds of different kind of characterizations of it? Is it against the law? Those kinds of things. What are the best sort of, now, once it comes out, basically, what are the best ways to sort of communicate to the public about, not just the public at large, of course, but the rest of the labor movement in terms of what this represents? And I know that there have been some resolutions at the local Fed levels and at the AFL-CIO levels. And so the importance of that in terms of communicating to members about the importance of this program and the importance and the fact that, again, that it's not a new innovation, deferred action, not just in terms of DACA, but actually in terms of labor disputes, has been going on for 30 years, right? And so what is the importance of that, I guess, in terms of communicating to the public and to the rest of the labor movement?
You want to kick it off, Natalie? I mean, I'll throw some thoughts out there, but I think, I hadn't thought about that question. I'm intrigued. And if I step back, one of the things that intrigues me is that, we talk about like workers' rights and like, and in some of that, there's like, some of us understand that we're also talking about like their legal rights. But in practice, right, in this country, we just have like a system and a history of like those getting stomped on all the time. And part of what we're doing here is, no, those are legal rights, and we are going to seek to exercise that to the maximum. And I think that's really important. I mean, I think, I wish the organizers of El Super campaign were here, because you have to hear the story of how the company and the lawyers just like got crushed upon seeing the worker having worker protection, and they didn't know it was coming, right? You got to understand what it does to a set of leaders to kind of get a protection and see the law work for them. And see documentation that the government has an interest in them, right? That is like, to me, unknown territory. I still kind of don't believe it, right? And so it's very important that we not only go and talk about these, whether it's new to some people, but it works. And let us show you how it works, what it looks like. Here's the models, here's the templates. But I think what we're also doing through Injury to All, correct me if I'm wrong, Liz and Natalie, is like we're just rolling up our sleeves and like troubleshooting, workshopping with people, trying to make it work and fit. We are not like the experts, but we're all organizers and I think are super invested in seeing this happen. And so I think the most important thing, though, is getting this into the hands of people that want to use it. I think we're trying to figure out, how do we not spend our time trying to fight and convince people to do it? Because you know what, there's enough people that actually just want to use this and run with it. And like their success is showing the way and getting people that might not have considered it to take a different look at it, because it is proving effective in kind of bringing momentum, supporting workers. And just, I think Liz and Natalie could tell you a lot more, about what that looks like. But I guess to me, that's, when I hear you say that, I think it means we're talking about like workers' rights as legal rights in a different way. And that to me seems really important for lots of reasons. So, but a quick stab at your question.
Yeah, and I think that's all right. And I think the talking point that Jobs and Justice is going to lead with whenever we finally get the DHS announcement, we can really celebrate and push out publicly as much as possible, which will hopefully be very soon, is that this is about the enforcement of existing rights. Right? This is about taking something that has been on paper and putting it into practice and making it accessible to workers. I think, because of the DACA court stuff and all of the things that have immigration related that have been strung up in the courts, there is this fear of the courts. I will say this is different than DACA, and that's part of the reason it's taken so long for DHS to come out with anything, and part of the reason they really wanted to be careful before they put out anything publicly on it, is to not get caught up. immediately into the courts. And I mean, it is fundamentally, not just that they're like trying to be careful, it is fundamentally different because it is based on the vetting and the need of a labor agency, right? So the application is hinged around the labor agency saying, I need this to protect my investigation. It's about the whole, it's about enforcing labor law rather than the humanitarian merits of somebody or how, how sympathetic an individual might be. This is about enforcing labor law. And so that is just a very different thing, right? In the reason for prosecutorial discretion and the way it plays out. But yeah, I think, what Carlos said, this is like the ultimate goal is to just get this out and do as much education around it as possible. And besides this toolkit being like one good way to start, hopefully there will be news from DHS soon, which I think will create some momentum of itself. So hoping once folks see that news from DHS, you can help push out that news, and that will also give us some more good work to do, some more good things to work with.
I mean,
right.
I'll just add to that just to say internally, and I would encourage, if there are other unions, this is not just a conversation we have with our organizers, this is a conversation we have within our union, right? And it is about the holistic work there. And so for us internally, getting the word out to our locals, our district councils, and making sure that they understand that this is not it's not new, right? It's just a new process or some clarification on a process, and that they can do it, right? And that we can help. And I think for us, that's been the key.
Right. Well, I think the framing of the toolkit as an injury to all really highlights the fact that, again, this is not just about the injury to the immigrant workers themselves, but to the injury to non-immigrant workers, residents who are also trying to organize, and the way that these forms of exploitation and retaliation can kill an entire organizing drive of a lot of different workers. And that was true in past cases in Hoffman Plastics itself. And so that's why, again, I think the framing of, I guess it's hashtag, right, injury to all, that should be out there, I'm sure, out on social media soon. Unless there are any other questions, I'm going to thank our panelists and the program committee of LRAN and Scott Klinger from LRAN for organizing this. And I think you could probably find the panelists very easily on LinkedIn or the internet, but I'm sure they are willing to follow up with anything else along these lines. And again, I want to thank everyone for a great discussion and plenty of great strategies going forward. And I wish everyone a good day, and we'll see you the next time. Take care.
Thank you.